Hey everyone, welcome to another disc guidance segment with the 2MK team. We don't normally have disc guidance at this time, but it is around the time when we do the checkup on our bots because of changes that have been made to the game. Normally we don't specifically do this a lot, but in the case of adding new V-skills, we would like to verify, show off, and clarify which of bots can be used for their original purpose with the different V-skill, which ones actually help you learn how to deal with the V-skill without any changes, and those ones that can be tweaked minorly or may need more specific overhauls. So if you're used to training with various bots, we will try to get some of these notes into the bot pages, but here's the refresher. They're going to be basically 39 characters to work with, 38 technically counting that Gil is not functionally a bot to review, but going from there, therefore, there'll be approximately 8 bots in the stream, because we do have some bots where we have more than one version on different accounts. Therefore, today, we're going to be looking at 8 specific characters. We're looking first at the ones that if you're just getting into this game, or you want to help out your friends who are getting into this game, we'll confirm for you today that those bots are working, especially since we're not going to get around to streaming this again for like a week. Therefore, let's start with our Ken bot. We're not starting with Nikali because Nikali is very specific about this, and we have a second form Nikali. As you can see, Ken is using both his V skill and his V trigger too. That is what you've just seen there. Ken's V skill 2 is that somersaulting kick. He's had this move for a while in other games. It's not always the easiest move to deal with, but since Ken's overall game plan and flow still work even if he doesn't actually run, we don't really think that our Ken bot is going to have a lot of problems, and he uses that move at around the same timing that you need to understand it. If you're coming up through the ranks, it's very likely that anyone you deal with is going to be using this sort of move just semi-randomly. It's not the sort of move you try to combo into or trick the opponent too much with. It's just, hey, I think this is going to be an opportunity for me because my opponent is moving forward or something, and therefore I just do it. How you counter it is up to you. You have to learn certain things about it. And since Ken's point system doesn't really rely on whether or not he actually does his run, and isn't really offset by him not doing it and using this move instead, the only thing that might happen is a slight change in rhythm. So far though, we haven't even noticed much of that. Ken's rhythm is more or less the same either way. Therefore, we suggest that you can use this to train against the move itself, and may even have a bit more to do in terms of that. If you're going to be demonstrating this or getting friends to play the game and use bots, you may actually specifically want to put Ken on the skill 2 to get them started. Run is hard to deal with, but generally it takes a little more skill to use and tends to not be used outside of combos as much by the average bronze to silver player. And you don't worry too much about the above average ones. Ken therefore gets a pass today. Overall, there's no need to worry that Ken bot has been drastically changed if your inputs are decently good. We won't spend much time on him therefore, and we'll just change onward to the next in line. Our Sakura bot also doesn't change that much. She doesn't use her V skill as often as Ken does. In fact, under most inputs of the bot, she will nearly never use it. Let's give her her own position. Because she nearly never uses it in most inputs, it's unlikely to affect her flow very much. What you will notice is that her rhythm will shift slightly, not because so much of the V skill, but because the space in which she does do it at the beginning of a round, or after a very specific type of knockdown, isn't really the type that we wanted initially for her. Her new V skill, however, works in a lot of similar ways, meaning that while it is a little off, it's not really a problem directly. We always had to do the same things basically, and you're going to have to put up with the same things overall. In fact, one thing that may be helpful here for the bot is that Sakura only tends to use her V skill once you've gotten quite good at the bot itself. Most of our bots have some way of increasing or improving the way they interact with you, the better you are at doing whatever the bot's goals are. In Sakura bot's case specifically, she is supposed to be checked when she dashes at you, but this is the most advanced and usually the hardest thing to do when training against her. If you can do it or deal with certain other things, like try to confirm your crouch medium kick against her in certain spaces in neutral. If you succeed at that, but let's say don't fully confirm your attack, this is usually where she gets to use her V skill, even if just for a moment. Overall though, because she spends a lot of time with edge shifts that allow her to do regular punches or kicks in the same space, you won't even see it. Right now, for example, it's right there, but a lot of the time that input is hidden or absorbed into something else, meaning that not only do you have to be hitting Sakura at a timing that is difficult and rare, she also would have to not have gone into that input from one that holds a different button. Of course, the good part of this is that the fact that it is so rare and that it only shows when you get good means that it barely matters most of the time. If you are still just more or less training with this game and the character, you're not going to have this come up as a thing that matters to you. You can, however, see that the timing for this is very interesting in that most of the time she will only do this right after a dash. And it would have to be that you check the dash. If you check the dashes too often, or if you often try to stop her with projectiles, depending on what the projectile strength is, she may get a chance to do this move, which is partially the point. You throw a projectile or clip her legs or something, and suddenly she's using her hop and you have yielded it. Overall though, our Sakura bot doesn't have anything that relies on this ability, and it's mostly just there in order to make it easier for people to understand what it does, and if you want to modify the bot to do it more often, it's an easy input to modify. We're not going to do that on this stream, but it's something to bear in mind. If you specifically decide that you would like to have her actually use it more, the input that is related to this is an easy one to both change and change back. So feel free to change it up so that you get whatever you need in terms of her use of that move. Of course, that is a bit more advanced and is overall at the discretion of the person using the bot to train. Given that Sakura is mostly there to train you to make sure that you're doing the right thing in response to moves that have very long recovery but don't specifically have crush counter property on punish, it's not really that interested in whether or not she rolls. But If you've input it correctly, you can note that she did just, for example, do it again. Her timing for stuff in most inputs of the bot will be such that she can get her follow-up, but it may end up being rare. This has to do with the way the game buffers a certain thing, whether or not she gets other things. And I wouldn't specify that you should put too much effort into either fixing it or thinking about it. It's just not worth your time. Given this, if you really want her to use this V skill so you can work on it, just change the input that contains it. The other inputs are usually fine. All you have to do probably is not make that a first frame input, and she'll be back to normal, or rather the opposite, doing exactly the opposite of what she normally does in no time, and you can switch her right back whenever you want simply by making a first frame input again. As it's not a specifically super easy input, you might want to be a little careful with it, but that has more so to do with timing. Specifically, the input that uses this is for Ash 4, where you do the first frame, down back, V skill, hold up forward, hit dash in the air, and at the peak of the V skill, jump, end the recording. So it may take you a little while to get the timing back into place, but it also usually isn't too harmful if she has a little variation in that when you're training, because you get to have very slightly different experiences. If you find that you have trouble getting this right again, consider leaving it the other way, since most people don't have a whole lot of trouble dealing with Sakura's V skill. And most people using Sakura don't seem to spam it as much as we were expecting to see it. They more so learn to do a combo with it and then just only use it then. Meaning that if you change it so that her V skill 2 is the important one you see, then that's all you really need to do, and you can just leave it that way. And probably if you've made even remotely good judgment about how to deal with that, anyone using the bot or that you're trying to help out by letting them try it should not really have too many problems. Meaning that we can now move on to the next in line. While we do have a couple more bots in the space before Birdie, Birdie is our graduating from getting used to the basics of bots. Because for Birdie, you need to be able to do multiple different things. Most of our bots teach you one specific thing, and there are only a few that act as the quote-unquote test to tell you that this is going on, and you checking your skills relative to everything at once. So, Birdie does have that distinction. And we'll also show off how he works with his V trigger too. We did a decent job on that one and didn't find that we had any problems the last time that we checked his ability to function using it. He doesn't do as many creative things as he could with it, combination with his V skill, but that's not going to matter given that in this particular form we are using a different V skill, so it won't show up at all. Most people input Birdie bot slightly differently than each other, but he mostly doesn't change his overall flow either way. Now, Birdie's V skill 2 is rather slow and a little bit confusing in terms of what exactly it does. However, Birdie's V skill before was a little bit more meaningful in this matchup than most things. And in order to use his V skill properly and have it have all its functions, one would have to change the way it was input. The main question then is, does Birdie specifically benefit from this, or does the bot get worse at what it's trying to do or teach you? Our verdict so far is that Birdie bot is slightly quote-unquote worse in this situation. It would be a little better if we change some of the inputs. He may not get a full overhaul, but we also need to look into this because this is one of those things where the move in question relies a lot on timing, both in terms of how long you hold a button or how well you set something up, and the precise rhythm of where in the bot's flow the move actually happens. Final result? Don't expect to be able to use this for much. Specifically, and in this case, we're just going to go right back to showing how much more effective the bot is with the other V triggers. So I'll have Kanzaki change him back to V skill 1, but leave his V trigger 2 for now. We don't currently expect this V trigger to be all that popular though, which is kind of a big deal relative to whether or not the bot is going to achieve its purpose. Generally, bots that have a very specific aim, you have to worry about whether or not they're achieving it. And you also have to worry about whether or not the player is learning the matchup properly. Birdie is not so much a character where you can learn the matchup in the same way, because while he does have a lot of tricks, though they're usually a lot more mind-gamey and a lot less forcing you to try to do something that you can't, try to react to something that you can't deal with. The one thing he has that is like that, namely Dolphin Dive, as it's called, is unlikely to go away just because of the rhythm relative to anything else. He takes about the same amount of time to chew the gum as he does to put down the can. Therefore, this all comes down to whether or not you face a Birdie player or find a way to face a Birdie player whose situational setups with the bubblegum are good enough that you feel the need to train against it. And in that case, feel free to experiment and let us know if you find anything. But we're also going to work on it at some point later on, especially if we find there are either more setups or something that the opponent can exploit or manipulate that we can find a way to put into the bot for you so you can train against it. As with almost all bots, anyone who's used them long enough and is comfortable with changing inputs within the bots already knows that if they need to do things in order to make the bot more functional for something they want to train on, there's almost always an input somewhere that they can use to shift the thing in question for them. You just shift that thing to whatever input you were going to use and then let the bot do the rest of its thing in order to keep you on your toes and make you feel more like you're having a full match, testing your speed, your reactions, and your overall understanding. Not every one of us has the exact same level of Birdie bot, but so far we can not tell any reason why a gender role Birdie bot input type is likely to be affected too much by changes along the same lines. And he does have a lot of moves required to set up things regarding the bubblegum already, meaning that if you can just find the right way to input it and the right amount of time for that input, it's going to be a lot more important and somewhat more interesting than working on figuring out the exact things to hide in that input, etc. So we're going to move on from there to the next one that most people will have a strong use for. after this long with Street Fighter. One of the main things that you don't learn easily while fighting with friends, because the friends don't put themselves in the situation over and over, or because you're trying to outthink a human and can't just train the aspect of the question, is hit confirming. And it's our Balrog bot, our boxer bot, that does this best. So we're going to use his V-trigger 2 simply because it slows him down enough to actually get anything else done. He looks much more effective and spectacular using VT1, and probably we may change to that depending on what shows up here, but for now, we're looking at his new V skill primarily. His new V skill is basically a sway style move. It's meant to get him out of the way of certain attacks and then let him do specific things afterward. Now, in normal flow, depending on the input, BoxerBot does use his V skill. He normally combos this into a move because it's a forward moving thing that has other buttons that it swings into. It generally doesn't affect the hit confirming aspect of him too much though. It just helps you have to deal with a lot of other things. What it will do is cause him to get close to you without keeping up a credible threat. As you can see, based on the timing of where that move is in his system though, it still has a relatively high effectiveness. If you've input the timing correctly, his little wiggly sway is just going to happen almost completely randomly. And in a way it does help with the bot's purpose. In the case of the other V skill, a lot of the time the player might be tempted to stand there and wait for him to come to them, reposition themselves, and so on. Or at least they'll feel more comfortable. This way the bot does less damage, but in terms of things like getting it confirms and feeling comfortable, you find yourself thinking more about how to avoid hitting more buttons than you need to. As a lot of the time, if he does do his little sway and you hit more buttons, he's probably going to come out of this by hitting a heavy and crush countering you, or hitting a combo that allows him to get more damage eventually, rather than keeping up pressure. Now, one could argue that this takes away a lot of the danger of the bot's high-low mix-up game, but technically that's more so a matter of the character, not the bot. In other words, if a player has chosen to use this V-trigger instead, this V-skill instead, then that player doesn't have access to that high-low game any more than the bot does. So, any shifts in your mindset should go to both that match and the situation. However, we did have to look into whether or not this affects his actual regular flow within his V-Trigger 1. So, now that he's demonstrated how it affects his V-Trigger 2 in that moment, we'll switch to how he does things in his VT1. This is what you probably would be more familiar with. And it is specifically important that you learn this with the same bot settings as always, so we're not even going to go so far as to show it off. He does take longer, for example, to reach his V meter max if that happens. And as you can see, learning to get him to do things like V reversals and so on means that you get a better idea of his rhythm as a whole. Now obviously he can just beat you up entirely without ever actually ending up using it, but this is all part of the game still. Therefore, the overall flow of the bot is not necessarily unaffected, but it is affected in exactly the way it should be. If your opponent is using this option, then the things they are able to do and not able to do, and the game plans related to that, match those that you're seeing in the bot. The primary goal, that of making sure that you can land your hit confirms and that you understand the movement of the character, are generally fine. So the fact that he occasionally stops mid-combo to sway or wiggle instead can make him feel less threatening, but he was never meant to feel very threatening. He's meant to sometimes be blocking and sometimes not, in a more dynamic way than simply having a dummy that happens to just be blocking or not blocking. And since he does not lose so much of his dynamism as to make it useless, we're relatively confident that you can use this bot as is going forward. Anyway, the only main thing being that he will take longer to reach the trigger, and in conjunction with some of the other changes the character has had, therefore you're likely to see a difference in amount of activation. Do note that overall, while it was intended that you learn to counter certain things within it, Boxer Bot was always intended to more or less either put you under extreme pressure or defeat you once he actually did activate his V trigger. One of the main things that is affected then is that if he is in the sway animation, he doesn't cancel into V trigger, but that's really not that meaningful either. He still cancels at most of the same times. Overall, therefore, you can consider him to be slightly slowed down, but not enough so that you have to think anything different about how the bot should work, outside of what happens when you change this character's V trigger, V skill. If you find that your version of him seems to be meaningfully slowed down by this, it may be because you were not able to be quick enough in the initial input for this, because the input required to have his V skill work correctly was one of the harder inputs to manage for the bot. It's extremely short, it's relatively strict, and it's very confusing. But overall, if you find that it isn't working, don't consider that it's all that big a deal, since most of the things you would want to do with the bot aren't really that specific to either one, meaning that if you needed to learn about the move, you'd still probably get to learn, and it's one of those moves where the opponent is going to be the one in control of most of the effects it has on the match. And that means we can move on to the next character in our list. Normally we try to keep the more obscure characters out of these things, especially ones that are harder to input. But of that group, we needed to make one exception. Depending on what you are doing and the way you learn to play this game in terms of distance, facing some of the more zoning bots can be really stressful. And one of the most stressful bots for this purpose, let's use the right stage for this actually, is another of the four kings.
How about a double dose of poison?
Fang's V Skill 2 is another simple move. It's basically just another parry that was added to the game. It's more so the Abigail style or parry, where he will actually hit you and in a scripted specific way, rather than the Ryu or now Gil style parry or blocking, I guess, where the character has freedom of movement after it. That said, FANG was designed such that he doesn't normally use his V-skill. By most standards, Fang's V-skill isn't that helpful, and almost certainly not in a bot situation, even with the changes that are bestowed upon it by his V-trigger 2. One of the fortunate things though is that Fang has always had the potential to use it at times that are not necessarily terrible, but didn't help because most players would just hit him out of it. Given the focus of FANG, this became a bit less likely. After all, if you were in the position where Fang was likely to use the move and had a good reason to fear him, you generally didn't hit any buttons and you just got to throw it out for free and nothing happened either way. Most players would then also be able to just ignore the fact that that's what they did. If they did happen to do it and hit him, it was just like, okay, well that had nothing to do with anything I was training, so it's ignorable. So despite having multiple V-skill tap inputs most of the time, because of the way they are placed in Fang's moveset and flow for this bot, you will nearly never see this move. Depending on your inputs, you may see it a little more often, but it's very unlikely that it's going to do any harm if you do. Your expectation should be that you may once in a blue moon try to hit Fang and get parried. This is, however, something more meaningful in terms of actual play. But this doesn't mean you can necessarily learn anything from it. The timings and choices that most players make relative to parrying are specific to the player. You can only train so much to not hit a button when your opponent might stop you. And even if you learned that, there could be consequences for playing that way that your opponent would then use against you. So, our general expectation is that you won't learn much from putting a lot of effort into making sure FANG can actually do his V skill too. If you would like to try it, this is kind of also an unfortunate thing, as he's one of the few bots we have where there isn't an easy way to change the input that he uses that contains it, and to be honest, it's not very easy to change any of Fang's inputs and still get a proper character. He's hard enough to input as is. But you did just get to see him do the same. Technically, he also wiggles. Everyone's wiggling these days. But it's not going to come up much, and when it does, don't expect it to have any meaning. But as you can see, it barely affects his rhythm. Even if your FANG bot doesn't look like this and it is the type that uses the back dash, because we do have a variant of this bot that uses the back dash, it's unlikely. You can focus a little bit on learning the length of the animation, seeing if you can get something, and in a way that can be its own challenge. Since he does it so seldom, maybe around the same amount of time that a regular player would bother to use it. Recognizing that it has happened quickly enough to do something about it, as rarely as he does it, could itself be a meaningful challenge. That said, don't put a ton of stock in it. And since it doesn't really interact with anything much, you don't have to worry about anything related to the B triggers either. Other things we could note relative to FANG are things like stuff related to his fly, but we already tested that. Some of our FANG bot actually do the fly a little bit, and some don't. Basically it. Depending on how you input the triple punch, he will have this ability or not have it. And most of the time he doesn't use it either way. That said, most FANG bot inputs that are, if the player is familiar with the fact that he can do this, he'll do it. That moment was the moment you're most likely to see this, in fact. There is some focus on dealing with FANG throwing you or you throwing him, and in most rhythms, after the throw tech, he has a chance to do this move. If you consider this good, then great, because he will do that in almost every version of FANG bot available. Like, even if you're not good at inputting this bot, that particular interaction should happen most of the time. Or rather, if he's going to do his parry, it's going to either be after he does the turnover flip kick and whiffs, or whiffs this. As you just saw, if he whiffs one hit and not the other, you have a chance of him doing it then. And if he gets into position but you actually tech his throw, he has a chance of doing it then. So at the moment, he does seem to have good spaces in his timing and rhythm for using the move. And therefore we just consider this effective. The bot doesn't need it, nor did he need the original. It doesn't take anything away from him, and it doesn't add anything in particular. It's just one more thing to think about on the road to understanding how to beat this strange character. And that means that we can now move along on our road to our next. Now, just to be clear, you're going to see this character more than once. And this is definitely a character that we expect to have to do a lot of work on. Vega has received an entirely new move. And that entirely new move is one of his old moves from older games, but now it's a charge move. And that means you have to deal with the fact that the bot is not going to have any such charges stored up, as we've never had a specific reason to give him one, nor does he easily have any place to put it. You would have to change at least something entirely. But that's not really related to his beam skill 2. We're going to have to look into how other people take the use of that move in order to demonstrate or check on a new claw bot. This character also has a lot of different variations in how you can input the bot, but we don't suggest changing the bot overall by using the one with the most variance or the one with the least variance, honestly, to try to make sure he has either that move or new uses for his V skill too. In fact, overall, his V skill 2 works fairly well. We ended up giving Ra a lot of timings where he's just moving forward a whole lot, or being annoying in some way that doesn't really suit his total goals as a character. So it's nice to actually have something that helps him get out of the way of things, instead of constantly putting himself into things. While this is slightly harder on the beginner player who needs to learn how to deal with his slide when it's punishable, having him have the back hop to sometimes make it harder to punish the slide because he's spaced better for it can be helpful to more advanced players fairly easily. Once again, another character that doesn't actually use that skill very often. But that doesn't tend to matter too much. It's also not a skill that you can really use in any abusive way, in neutral or otherwise. Your opponent is not too likely to be surprised unless they're playing super offensively, and he already had enough tools to stop people from trying to beat him by being super offensive or playing risky in neutral. He doesn't deal as well with pressure otherwise, but that wasn't really the thing we were getting into. Differences in behavior for this bot are very specific. He has a lot of different ways that he can be right or wrong in terms of inputs. Or at least just have different behaviors, because not always you can say that right or wrong is a thing for him. We kind of offer people, hey, you should fight multiple claw bots. One relatively important thing though, which we're just going to go straight into showing off, is that if you change him to V-Trigger 1 and don't have him use the V-Trigger 2, he works better with this V skill. The timing of it meaning that he's more likely to combo out of it, and when he doesn't combo out of it, his rhythm is better. So if you're going to be using his V skill 2, we suggest you do it with his V-Trigger 1. The whole thing is more likely to affect his rhythm in a way that will make him a little bit harder to deal with, and make it a little bit more punishing when you do mess up and actually fall into getting hit by that move. As he is set up, we don't want him constantly using his V-Trigger, but that also means it's a little nicer to have this relatively easy way for him to do things that lead to him building up V-Meter faster, other than getting beat up and losing his claw or mask. As you can see, it's going to end up being at least a little bit predictable because he just cancels whether or not he actually landed the hit. But you know, given that the goal of the bot is primarily to help you deal with his aerial moves, we are eventually going to have to expand on this version of it so that he can use the Sky High Claw, and we can figure out what he can use that for, when he should use it, and so on. As you can see, there's not a whole lot of spaces in his movement where we can afford a down charge. He's generally moving quite fast, and we don't want his flow messed up too much as a result of it. meaning that we're more likely to make a Clawbot variation or more so a completely different Clawbot than to just have that work that way. And that means we're going to be waiting to see what new fighting styles pop up. If anyone develops an entire alternative style for this character based on the use of it, then you can bet that we will happily shift things around so that you get a new Clawbot. But for now, what you see is what you get, and his overall flow and purpose are unlikely to change a lot. One thing that does help here though is because the player is so much less interested in moving to the perfect position to get the slide punish as a result of the chance that he will hit the Matador flip, or will just keep on getting out of the way. It does make that aspect of the Footsies game a little more complicated, enough so that you might benefit from it. In other words, there's definitely no downside to putting him to be skill 2. And you might get something out of it even if the move itself is not that threatening. It does change the bot's behavior enough to force you to think about it differently. In the end though, that's about all we have to say about him. So, we're on to the bots that will get the most attention on this stream. One of these bots has a massive change to their V skill options, and the other has technically a weird almost not change. But in one case, the bot's rhythm is almost unchanged. In the other case, it is drastically changed. Leading to a lot of confusion in here, honestly.
Union Station. Karin Kanzuki. Kage.
Now, since Kage is very heavily based on his V-Trigger 2 as a bot, and he was created at a time when V-Trigger 2 existed, we're not going to be reviewing anything related to his V-Trigger 2 or anything in that part at all. We're just going to assume that everything works out fine. The V-Skill 2, therefore, pairing with the V-Trigger 2 is the most important thing here, simply because that's what we care about on the bot side. Training against Kage is similar to training against Sakura, understanding how to get out of various Kage things and how properly to punish him when he does mess him up. You know, that stuff. This bot actually is supposed to do his V-Skill decently off. He's usually just too busy doing everything else. And that's actually the primary reason why you won't see it that often. He's just too busy doing everything else. By design, he has full meters, which means he spends a ton of time doing everything possible to kill you. And it simply comes down to the fact that this occasional use of his V-Skill is not high enough on his, let's call it, priority list to actually happen that much, but you've seen it now, and he's been kind enough to demonstrate it twice. He does have other ways of doing this, but none of them matter too much to the purpose of the bot. Learning to defend against that is about the same as learning to defend against his other stuff. What makes it so important is that when he has this capacity set up properly, and the fact that he technically is supposed to hit charge on his move, means you have to spend a lot of time thinking about when he may do it, and that becomes more important than whether or not he does do it, just as in a real match. Kage bot is intended to make you feel as if you have to defend, and in fact, if you try to fight this bot similarly to how you fight Furious, by forcing yourself to try to play footsies while watching the air, then you can find where the V skill has its bigger effect. Because you can learn to counter the grounded V skill fairly easily. Recognizing how to deal with the new one within that same context is harder. In short, if you find yourself blocking for long periods of time against Kagebot, you could be getting more out of it. Because this character has a good tick throw, and while we didn't specifically put a lot of effort into making sure the bot uses it, you do have to consider it. Because most Kage players are very good at managing to get that throw somehow. If you do happen to actually get opened up by our Kagebot, not a really, normal thing to happen, most of us, just because it's the most sensible feeling thing to do, we end up blocking this bot for a really long time. As you work on your, hey, I shouldn't just block whenever Kage gets close to me reaction, he will get more and more effectively powerful. This bot is encoded such that the better you get at checking his dashes, solving the puzzle he presents without specifically blocking a lot of it, and similar, the more likely he is to do more creative things. And the B skill is absolutely among those things. It will be hidden in a lot of his moves if you just let him do what he wants. But if you handle him by doing certain dashes, certain types of checking his jumps, certain types of checking his dashes, you're going to find yourself facing this move way more. If you're the type who has a way around zoning, you generally still have trouble with this bot because it does red fireball instead. But if you're the type that gets through fireballs instead of actually trying to absorb or parry or block them, you also get the fact that, hey, if he throws a fireball at you and you say you jump over it, which is a thing you can do, he's more likely to have the fireballs go on the screen, which changes his rhythm in other ways, and results in you getting more uses of the V skill too. Since this point system is at least partially based on landing Mikis on him after doing other things, You absolutely can get away with most of your gains purely by blocking more. But just remember that it's not going to be among the better ways to learn to fight Kage as a character. And he does have the capacity to at least forward dash into V skill, which means that if you have a late punish, he may get you. Now, we do still need to show off his trigger 1 option. We've demonstrated enough, hopefully, how and why he's effective at the job otherwise, so let's go ahead and change him to V trigger 1 and clarify exactly why this is still so important. In Kage's V trigger 1, his V skill is empowered. And this is generally how you want to train against this spot if you're really interested in learning how to deal with the V skill specifically. If you're fairly sure you've got the whole Demon Super thing down, he spends a lot of time in V-Trigger. He spends a lot of time doing nifty things in V-Trigger because of the way that he's set up to do this. He cancels into the move a lot. Meaning that now when he does it, it will take the space of something else he wanted to do otherwise. You will still get some periods where he doesn't have the V trigger active and therefore basically won't have any problem acting as normal. But if you've trained enough with the other form, enough to say with some confidence that you know how to deal with the move in its normal form, then switching to his V trigger 1 is about as useful as it was when Kage's V skill is V skill 1. This one is a bit more tricky simply because of the way that we react to movements of certain types in this game though. And Kage is a character heavily built around changing your perception of what you should do in a situation quickly, and then you having to deal with that. So as a player, if your aim is to work on the skill 2, and you feel you've mostly dealt with the things Kagebot does and want to learn about it more so, you can use the same type of thing, and instead of punishing Super, just deal with or punish the empowered V skill. He does them at about the same rate, and you'll be surprised at the number of weird options you have against this move. So feel free to experiment with them and see what you come up with. His rhythm is not terribly changed by anything that's been changed about him. In fact, from the bot perspective, all that happened was that he got a thing that made a certain input easier technically. If you didn't put in your Kage bot all that well, then it's not going to matter. In fact, he will be almost more effective if you didn't. In this particular mode, that is. With V trigger 1 and V skill 2, he may be a little better if you input him not as well, in terms of a particular part of the holding buttons for timing and so on. He is, of course, not going to be as dangerous on the dashes or when you need to check the dashes. But, you know, you'll still learn something. And since he doesn't completely spam this move, and his V trigger does take a while to go down, basically only being used for either the teleport or the V skill, you will at least get some chances to deal with it if he does manage to get activation. And if he gets close enough to you, activation is pretty likely. So it brings us to our last character of this day too, because for some reason I'm sniffling today. So for this stream, we come to the other, not one of the characters that specifically has you deal with, let's say, things she does per se, but rather everything. We did not treat her as putting it all together in the same way, because the way in which she is special for this doesn't quite match that. And in this case, we're not going to use the 10 Nanocrata because it's not that it doesn't do anything. In fact, it can be very, very frustrating on the bot. But in this case, we want to be able to show the rhythms related to the Gurren.
Is unparalleled. Shall we begin?
This is in fact the last bot of the night, so the stream is coming to an end relatively soon. In news related to bots, our guild bot is doing quite well, and my concern that I would have to make a separate fire and ice version seems to be unfounded, so we might just have a functional guild bot for you by Friday to show off in minimum at Robotics Lab. And if we're a little bit lucky and find enough testing time, maybe even this guidance. He's reasonably simple and it's kind of obvious what his core game plans as a bot should be. How players deal with it, different question, but definitely we're gonna get some guild bot ready for you to at least look at. And probably released by Sunday unless we come up with any really terrible fails in what it does, or find something online from the tech community where he has some setup that you have to learn to deal with in order to fight the character effectively. Most of the time, our bots do tend to quote-unquote do these on their own, simply because there are only so many paths you can take. But depending on the specifics of the inputs, some of them are harder than others. Now, as for our Karin bot, she generally plays in a relatively aggressive style. Depending on your input, she may be extremely aggressive, but most of the time she flows at a very footsies style experience, and this results in her barely using her V skill intentionally. It's hidden, and while it is functionally a part of her footsie game, it is not one that we could put in a bot simply because of the amount of time she would do it. Or, to put it more accurately, she does do the move, but she does it really seldom, and you have to be playing footsies with her at a relatively high level before she will just suddenly do it. When we say playing footsies with the Karin bot at a high level, we mean things like attacking her throws, finding moments to check her dashes correctly, and of course the super hard, interrupting her between crouch medium punch and crouch medium kick. If you're doing these things well enough, Karin bot's rhythm naturally changes. And that's another full design intention that plays out fairly well in most inputs of the bot, even though she is relatively hard to input. Therefore, in general, you should expect that if you have a decent Karin bot and can play to the relatively high level required to deal with everything she is intended to help you learn to deal with, you're going to see more of her B-skill 2, or well, B-skill usage, and in this case that would be B-skill 2. But as you can see, unless you're really dedicated to this, it doesn't come up that often. And this is fine, because her B-skill 2 is, honestly, not that meaningful. I don't want to downplay it too much, but it basically looks like someone just gave her a slow version of Chun-Li's Bat Heavy Punch and made it crush counter, because it helps that she has now a big crush counter. It seems to be more so a move she can use to build V-meter extremely quickly. It's really good at building V-meter, and therefore is helpful in matchups where you somehow don't need the Mayokin, but expect your opponent to give you a lot of opportunities for crush counters. You'll hear more about that in terms of when it should be done from Kanzuki Dynasty at some point, maybe in a Monday stream. If we have another lounge stream, she might mention it. If we have another stream of this type, she might still mention it. But at some point in this, you probably got to see her use it once, so you know it's in there, and the spacing and timing for it aren't terrible. But she's just not going to use it that often. We can, however, change her to V-Trigger 2, and we'll do that now. In most inputs of Karin bot, giving her V-Trigger 2 will make her meaningfully less dangerous and teach you nearly nothing about Gurenken. But if you understand Gurenken enough already, there's certainly no harm in switching her this way. Most players will at least benefit a little from occasionally having her in that form, because it reminds them of the fact they have to get used to, for example, throwing her after certain specials while she's in that mode, just to get different punishes. The timings related to her usage of her V-Trigger mean that technically it's almost completely random in this bot. Sometimes she'll just randomly do it in neutral, and sometimes she'll perfectly do it randomly as you're attacking her or as she's finishing a special. But because of the timing, she will not do it after every special. In fact, with her current inputs, you have no way to know whether or not she's going to, except to know that after Orochi she technically can't. What can you take away from this as a player? That's often up to you, honestly. But the overall of, has this character been meaningfully affected? Well, there you go. And that. So in short, it's in there. It's there just to occasionally make you go, wait, right, yes, she can do that. But not so overwhelming that the bot is constantly doing it, or failing anything, or causing itself trouble in its own flow and Footsie's game by doing too much of it. What you're going to get a lot of the time then is effects that are based partially on your own character, which is honestly how Karin bot was intended to be. If you interrupt her in the right timings and footsies, you may see these things. And I guess, depending on your character, the effectiveness of her VT2 versus her VT1 is decided there, mostly because of the range you're at, and whether or not you benefit from the fact that she pushes forward her hit bots and therefore hurt bots in the case of one move, and less so in the case of the other. Thankfully, this does help even further, preventing this particular bot from becoming predictable enough for you to do anything with it. But the overall effect of the V skill 2 on it is absolutely minimal, as intended. As a player, if you need to learn a lot about this move, we don't have any suggestions that actually involve Karin bot. You can give the CPU and it will do some useful stuff with it, but as the move is simply just not that meaningful for most things, it's probably going to be meaties or something that people use it for, etc. Don't expect to see a lot here because our bots are not generally built to do meaties except like lava. Therefore, that brings us to about the end of this stream. We will be having Kame House as always tomorrow. We're not having another of these segments right away. As I mentioned, this is intended for, these are the bots you're most likely to use if you're just getting into this, but you know someone who has them, or your input skill is good enough to input in bots. These are among the first you do, as they're relatively popular characters, and also stressful or tricky enough that there's something specific to learn about them. I mean, FANG isn't a top popular character, but I think I explained why he's in here. That means that we have another 4 streams of this to show off different ones. We will try to make it so that those 4 streams don't necessarily get spread over 4 weeks. But it is entirely possible that that is what will happen, simply because of priority. And we do have some bots where we must do some work. For example, Jury needs an entire, not so much an overhaul, but a relook at how she times certain things to see if we can improve them. If she wants to have that, so it's likely you'll get a Jury bot too if you're interested in specifically that. If we find out that it's really good and doesn't just matter to the opponent's skill in setting up a meaty, for example. And we're definitely going to come back around to this account when we're going to be showing off characters like Akuma, Minat, Ibuki, who all have these skills that don't really change their game plan that much, but it's still worth showing off whether or not the bot is effective too meaningfully to use. As it stands now, you can expect Gilbot Disc Guidance, or at least Robotics Lab, on Friday as mentioned. And if that works out, we'll see it released on Sunday as usual. As always, you can find all of our bots for both this game and other games, including exercises for Guilty Gear Xrd, on our website 2-mk.org. and information on streams as well as Guildbot release timings and updates on if we get delayed somehow when doing so. On our Twitter, 2_MK_FGC. If you have any questions for us or information to give us about your own testing regarding the bots, the contact page at 2-mk.org will let you get in touch with us, or you can in fact contact us on Twitter, even though that tends to get looked at more so when we intend to stream, which means that you may not get an answer right away depending on what the stream's content is. So, this has been part 1. 4 more to go. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training, and good night everyone.